Hey, Pastor Steve here. This past weekend, I preached a message through several verses in Colossians chapter 3, talking about putting off our old sinful nature and putting on the new nature we have in Jesus Christ. And there are things in our life that are that old sinful nature, and we just need to make sure we identify them and get them off, to lay them aside, to put them to death. And Paul lists a few examples, such as, greed and evil desire and lust and impurity, sexual immorality. But he also lists in verse 8 of chapter 3, Colossians, to put away anger, wrath, slander, malice, filthy language, lying. And it really struck me that this is something we probably don't talk a lot about, but if Paul is listing it, then it's a big deal. Anger, and malice and slander and filthy language and lying. It's a big deal. And why is it such a big deal for especially a Christian? Well, in a similar passage in Ephesians, which is very similar to Colossians, in chapter 4, Paul talks a little bit more about anger, and he talks about being truthful to one another. And in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, "Be angry and do not sin." And so that's where we get this idea that there is righteous anger. There is things that we need to be angry about. We can see God. God was angry. Jesus was angry. And so there has to be some form of righteous anger. And Paul's saying, be angry, but don't sin. There's a right trigger for our anger, but there's also a wrong response to our anger. And then he says, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. There is a proper duration for our righteous anger. And it talks about don't let the devil give you an opportunity to really mess you up. But in the midst of all of this, Paul says, don't grieve the Holy Spirit. And then he goes right into, let all bitterness, anger, and wrath, shouting, and slander be removed from you among all malice. And so anger and bitterness and malice and slander and foul language, it grieves God. It grieves his heart, even though there's a way in which we can be righteous in our anger. When we have it done the wrong way in our response, when it lasts longer than it should and so forth, it doesn't do us any good. In Hebrews chapter 12, it said to make sure that there is no root of bitterness among you, because then it can grow and cause a lot of issues. So it's something that you and I really need to take heart. We really need to identify and admit and acknowledge where there is anger in our lives. More than just irritations and frustrations, more than just grumblings and murmurings, is anger. At the beginning of creation, when Adam and Eve then sinned against God, we see that in Genesis chapter 3, that when God came in his wrath to approach Adam and Eve and find out what was going on, even though he knew what was going on, it said in verse 10 that they heard God and they were afraid because they were naked. They were guilty and shameful, and so they were afraid and they hid. Now, by the time you get to chapter 4, you have Cain and Abel, and God looked at the offering, the sacrifice of Cain, and he wasn't happy with his offering. In chapter 4, verse 5, it said, he did not regard for Cain and his offering. And then Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. He looked discouraged. He looked depressed that what he had to offer wasn't good enough. He had guilt. But then that just made him very angry, to where he went out and murdered his brother. Violence. By the time you get to chapter 6, God looks at the entire world and says, everything that is in the human heart is bent towards evil. And so I think there's a progression here that we can see where it starts off in fear and then shame and guilt and hiding to outbursts and frustration, irritations, even discouragement into violence and then to widespread violence. And that has me thinking about a lot about what's going on here in this world, is that there is a lot of fear and unknowns, a lot of guilt and shame put on other people because of COVID and the vaccine or elections and the restrictions and the mandates and so on and so forth, is that we can feel afraid, we could feel frustrated, we can feel discouraged, we may have gotten furloughed and lost our job, and we have no idea when or if we're going to be able to return to work. We're still waiting for unemployment and so on and so forth. So many unknowns in our life. We can get discouraged, we can get afraid, we can get anxious. And those can really build up in us and can turn into unhealthy, unrighteous anger and unrighteous responses. And so my challenge for us is that we can talk a lot about what we need to do with our anger, but I think we really need to spend a lot of time just admitting and acknowledging and identifying the anger within us. It'd be good for us to write down the things that irritate us, the thing that frustrates us, the things that make us grumble and complain. I mean, I think that's a sure sign that there's something in us. The more we find ourselves just complaining and complaining and complaining, what is that all about? Write those things down and then ask ourselves, why? Why does that bother me so much? Why does it bother me more? Is it a righteous botherment? Maybe it is, and maybe it should be. And then is our response? Is the duration of our irritation longer than it needs to be? Is the way in which we express it, is it done in an unrighteous way? And we just need to identify that, acknowledge that, and admit those things. And you may be saying, nothing really bothers me at all. I mean, I'm a pretty easygoing person, and so I'm not really bothered by anything. I go with the flow. And my challenge is to you is like, is that really true? Is that really honest? Are there really nothing that bothers you? Or is there things that probably should bother you? I mean, if God gets upset, if Jesus got upset, there probably is occasions where we also need to get upset. I mean, as we are loving on our neighbors, there's going to be times where things, injustices that we can see should be bothering us. And so maybe we just need to expand our horizons of the injustices that are happening even around us. Just some thoughts. Love to hear what you think about anger. And we'll have more discussions about this, I'm sure. All right. God bless. See you next time.